So,
Hello.
hello. All right, everyone. Well, welcome. Are we good?
We are live.
All right, we're live. Welcome to the Castine Historical Society. I'm Lisa Simpson-Lutz. I'm the executive director. And yes, we are also live streaming this on our YouTube channel. I just love saying that. It sounds so, I don't know, hip. I don't know. It's just not a historical society, right? Well, anyway, thank you for coming tonight. This is the first in a series of lectures for this 2024 season. And the lectures, for the most part, are about Castine history. The exhibit that we have on view, which we opened on Monday, is A History of Castine in 40 Objects. And so we wanted to have the lecture series focus on Castine history. So to learn more about the series, in the back of the room, you can pick up our newsletter. In the inside, there is a spread that shows the different lectures and events. We also have a walking tour as part of the series. And also, if you're currently not a member of the Castine Historical Society, we encourage you to join us. There are also membership forms back there. The exhibit will be up until Indigenous Peoples Day in October. And as I said, it's the history of Castine in 40 objects. And the idea behind the exhibit was to bring out some of our never-before-seen objects in our collection that tell stories about Castine's history. So for tonight, we're going to be learning about Castine men who served in the Civil War and that are buried in the Castine Cemetery. Our speakers, Ned and Diane, will talk about how that came about. If you go see the exhibit, there are a number of things related to the Civil War in the exhibit and to Castine. One is Henry Butler. He was a soldier in the war, and we have the rings that he carved for his wife and his son while he was in the war. They're made from animal bone. And you'll also see the pocket surgeon kit that belonged to Dr. George Wheeler. Wheeler was a surgeon, assistant surgeon during the war, and as most of you know, he later became one of Castine's doctors, and is probably best known to us as the author of the History of Castine that was written in the 1870s. So that kit was a kind of a recent find, and we're pretty excited to be able to show it. It has recently been conserved. You'll also see a number of items that were in the meeting room of the Castine Grand Army of the Republic Post, which ended up being in Emerson Hall. And these items were donated to us when we inherited or bought this building, and they're now part of our collection. And the Grand Army of the Republic is the veterans organization that was organized for Civil War soldiers and sailors. So for tonight's talk, we have Diane and Ned Smith here, and they're going to be both speaking. The Smiths have written 6 books documenting various aspects of Maine during the Civil War, which are all available for sale over there on the table after tonight's talk.
That's our retirement plan.
Yes, right. During COVID, they traveled around to small community cemeteries and investigated the graves of the men who served in the Civil War. They came to us to do some research, and we thought it would be a really interesting talk tonight to hear a little bit more about these men, see their graves, and in some cases see photos and learn a little bit more about them. All told, 106 men from Castine served in the Army, and another 21 served in the Navy. And that is out of a population of around 1,000 residents. It was a little more than 1,000 that were living in Castine during the Civil War. So like all Maine towns, we had a very large population of men who served in the war. So with that, I will be turning this over to whoever is our first speaker. Is it Ned? Is it Diane? Which one? Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much.
While Diane is giving you a little introduction, how many of you have a Civil War medieval? That's what they were shooting at each other.
So, okay, I'll remind you that because of the YouTube.
Hi. Civil War mini ball. It's what they were shooting at each other. It's a .58 caliber hunk of soft lead. I'm going to pass this one around. I always carry one with me to remind me of how awful it was. Soft lead, it hit you here, you had no bone left from there to there. So many amputations. Anyway, I will pass that around while Diane does her introduction.
Thank you so much for coming, and on such a nice evening, too. And thank you to Castine Historical for allowing us to share our investigations on Castine's Civil War veterans. Our major incentive for both our research and writing and for these inquiries into central Maine and coastal cemeteries is that we want Maine to remember their Civil War veterans.
You just did two.
Oh, did I?
Go back one.
Okay. And there's the quote here from Joshua Chamberlain, and also the Castine monument.
You'll see so many of those in towns all over Maine. Not as nice as that one.
This project that brings us here tonight began when my latest book, Washington Rumbling Civil War, was out, and at the same time the COVID epidemic began. So all book tours, book signings, everything was canceled. We came home to Holden, Maine, and started visiting cemeteries in central and coastal Maine, and then spent the winter researching these veterans. And we found that we wanted to share what we were finding, and that brings us here. This happens to be Lubeck, their monument. And this being Maine, we came prepared. And I'll turn it over to you, Ned.
Some of the things that we have found annoying over the years. The Civil War was about slavery, folks, period. Every document that the Confederate States used to justify seceding talks about one issue, slavery. In the 1920s, with the resurgence of the Klan, they came up with this whole noble lost cause stuff. Sorry. Anyway, unnecessary war. Are you aware of the fact that folks from the South were invading places like Guatemala to try and add more slave states? The guys at the Alamo, Mexico had outlawed slavery. And all these guys who came from the South, Davy Crockett included, a lot of them owned slaves and were not happy about that. So anyway, click. We were down in Richmond doing some research recently, and I'm finding it so refreshing. This is at the Tredegar Iron Works. They made a lot of the artillery pieces for the Confederacy. How slavery caused a civil war. Well, if you're talking about that very openly in Richmond, then, you know, progress is being made. Not everybody in the North was thrilled. Were there any slaves here in Maine? Yeah, there were. We tell them to call them domestic servants, but they were slaves. The Copperheads, pretty active here in Maine, an anti-Civil War group. There we go. It became illegal to import slaves from Africa. The only person executed for violating that was a ship captain from Maine. And you can see how the vote went. And I will take a moment to talk about how democracy can fail. Stephen Douglas, popular sovereignty, let's let these new states all vote whether to be free or slave. Sorry, I'm going out on a limb. Slavery's bad. I don't care how many people vote for it. It's not a good idea. So, popular sovereignty, yeah. I mean, it sounds very kind of noble, but no. Breckinridge. Oh yeah, and the other thing a lot of people don't realize, Lincoln didn't run on a platform of ending slavery. He was opposed to the spread of slavery to the new states and territories. 1863 draft, when the draft law came in. As you can see, not everybody was keen to go. And there are a number of reasons for that. I think probably the main reason is that the guys who were keen to go had already gone. They had already volunteered. So the ones that had stayed back were not thrilled about this whole thing. To show you how naive, this is off topic, sorry, show you how naive some of the early enlistments were. After the first Battle of Bull Run, where the Union Army got really badly beat up, the Confederates said, hey, we won, we can all go home now. And a lot of them did. So, oops. This area. And again, as Lisa was saying, 106 or possibly even more were in the infantry and 20-something in the Navy. So a lot of guys out of a fairly small town. Yeah, hi. Oh yeah, you could pay someone to go in your place. I mean, well, there are two things, I'm sorry. You could hire a substitute, which was to pay someone to go, pay a commutation fee that you paid that to the government and they found somebody to go in your place. That's the whole thing about rich man's war, poor man's fight. Yeah. Hannibal Hamlin, by the way, volunteered after he was no longer vice president. He volunteered for the Union Army. He went in as a private. He never saw combat, but he peeled a lot of potatoes, apparently, which I think is kind of cool. State of Maine as a whole.
So what would the age have been that you could be drafted?
18, I think it was 43 was the top, something like that. But people lied on both ends. Some kids said, oh yeah, I'm 18. I'm 18. Voice changing in the middle of it. And then I have some guys in one of my books who were 50-ish and claimed to be in the early 40s. So yeah.
That's a high physical disability.
Yeah. I often wondered about that, what you could claim as a disability. And I don't know how the Army surgeons well, I remember when before I went in the service, my pre-induction physical, the doctor asked me if I knew what my blood pressure was. No, yeah, you look, yeah. Okay. So I don't know how thorough it was. I don't know whether they examined people to find out what they really had going or not. All right. This is just an example of one who did answer the draft, survived, became a cabinet maker and undertaker here in town. An example, by the way, of guys who were in more than one regiment. When the 3rd Maine folded up, he went into the 17th. Reverberations. We did a program just before COVID for the National Park Service. They picked the 6 regiments from the north and 6 from the south that lost the most men in a single battle. We did the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. When Grant needed more infantry, is the sound okay or am I wandering? Okay, good. when Grant needed more infantry for his overland campaign in '64, here's a musket. You are now infantry. They had no infantry training. They went in, well, the whole reverberations thing was about the impact on the towns. Because, as Diane was saying earlier, so many regiments were raised in fairly discrete areas. If you lost 20 guys from one regiment, that was probably 20 guys from the same town. I was talking to somebody earlier about the fact that we did a program for Bradley, Maine, a little town. They had 4 kids die in Andersonville prison out of that one town. And so anyway, we did a program here in Bangor, and then we went down to Petersburg and did the same program again on the battlefield down there with our park ranger friend, Ann Blumenshine. I seem to be, there we go. The Castine Light Infantry. When they were forming these regiments early in the war, they had color. They had from Bangor the Gymnasium Company. They had the River Tigers from Old Town. They had, it was going to be cool. We're going to go out and whip those Confederates, and it'll be fun. The Castine Light Infantry, a lot of guys. Is it still me?
I don't know. What slide is it?
I don't know.
No, it's me.
Oh. Can I go back? Sure.
I'm just trying to read the bottom. Of the 103 members
Yeah.
listed, only 32 are listed as present for duty at the end of
In 62.
So does that mean they ran away or they were?
No.
They're dead?
Between sickness, disability, and being killed, Second Maine, they had some nasty, nasty battles. Think about those, like I said, First Bull Run, where the Union Army broke and ran back to Washington. They had some really nasty. And part of the problem, too, believe it or not, early in the war, some Union regiments were issued gray uniforms. And there are stories about, being fired on by your own men, but also they would get so close that it was too late by the time they figured out who it was. Is this you? Oh, okay. It's her.
Very good, thank you. I'm glad we still have this slide up because the 2nd Maine was the 1st Maine regiment that went to the front. And there were so many Castine men, volunteers, these weren't draftees, these were volunteers, who went in the 2nd Maine that their company became known as the Castine Company. So a remarkable turnout of Castine boys and men. Did I do 2? Yeah.
You want me to do the clicker?
Yeah, sure. John Lewis, is that? Oh, that's wonderful.
That's your guy?
Yeah.
Good. I thought we had him.
Yeah, the name was familiar. I want to tell you that there were so many boys and men from Castine who served in the Civil War that there was no way that we could include everybody. I'm glad we included John Lewis. Forgive us if a veteran you're particularly familiar with is not included. We mentioned John Lewis, who was in Company B, 2nd Maine. He was a sailor. He was wounded at First Bull Run, the regiment's first battle. By the way, if you take a walk through Castine Cemetery, you'll notice it makes it easy to find the veterans in a couple of ways. These are military stones. And I was talking about that only veterans can have these stones. They were supplied by the government. And I think that it was a matter of pride as far as their families were concerned. But also you have a star, a flag holder, that's the Grand Army of the Republic. a veterans group that formed after the war. So it's another way that makes it possible to find these veterans.
We, by the way, are such softies. We bought a whole bunch of flags. So we made sure when we were going around that all the veterans had flags. Some towns do a great job, some not so much.
Yeah, it seems to be slacking off a bit as far as making sure the flags go on. But, okay, it's time for Isaac Shepard. One of the things, I'm sorry? John Lewis?
John Perkins.
Oh. I don't have, oh yes, I do have him, I'm sorry. He was discharged
For hours.
early in the war, discharged for disability, which would be sickness. It was interesting because when the 2nd Maine went to the front, it was noticed that they were fine big lads. They were lumberjacks and fishermen and farmers, and were an impressive body of troops. But they had one great disadvantage, and that was that they did not have the kind of immunity that Slim Kid from New York City had. And sadly, they were very subject to illness. And a lot of them were lost because of it. Can we go on to Isaac? Yes. A case is Isaac Shepard of Castine, again, Company B, 2nd Maine, who died over that first winter of typhoid. And it's again, you know, when you think of the families at home, the loss that it meant to them. That family was hit hard in that Isaac's brother was lost at sea just the year before.
Also, somebody, was it you that mentioned the brother went down to collect the body of the, you had to pay to have your kid's body brought home. So a lot of those stones, there's nobody buried there.
A cenotaph, they call it. So it's a memorial stone, but there's no one buried
They
there.
died in wherever. They were very often buried in what are now these big military cemeteries. Anyway, sorry.
Edward Lawrence. We have a musician here.
Yeah.
There was, how many people have seen the movie Gettysburg? Yes, okay. Because part of the drama of the movie is that there were 2nd Maine men who were transferred to the 20th Maine on Little Round Top. They were there because they were considered mutineers. Kind of a shocking attribute. But there was an amazing backstory behind it. When the Castine men went to Bangor, as a body actually, they signed up for 2 years, to serve for 2 years. There was a lot of pressure to sign up for 3 years, and some of them succumbed to that. Along with, we're told, the promise that, oh, don't worry about it. When the 2-year men go home, you'll go home too. Well, they didn't. Just before Gettysburg, the 2-year 2nd Maine men got to go home. The 3-year 2nd Maine men did not.
If you had been mustered in, there's a switch here, I'll bet. If you had been mustered in one day after the 2-year men, you were it's not working, you were a 3-year man.
So as Ned has already pointed out, the 2nd Maine had a hard war. And when their fellow soldiers went home, they laid down their arms and refused any orders until they got sent to the 20th Maine. And remarkably, Joshua Chamberlain, who was in command of the 20th, was able to convince them how important it was that they picked up their muskets and joined the 20th Maine at Gettysburg, and they did serve very well. You can go on. This is one of the mutineers, but there's another complication, another backstory. The second Maine, Ned already mentioned that things happened to the second Maine that never should have happened. They never should have gotten sent into battle in a gray uniform. They ended up getting shot at by some of their own federal troops. And there were other really pretty disgraceful things imposed on them. At one point, when they got back to camp after First Bill 1, they were issued rotten meat, rotten supplies. The gray uniforms that they had been wearing were falling apart. A lot of them didn't have clothing, didn't have shoes. And at one point, they refused to go out, not into battle, they refused to go out on guard duty. To their misfortune, their commander at that time was William Tecumseh Sherman, who promptly decided they had all to be arrested and tried for desertion. And eventually it worked out. The men, when it became known what the circumstances were, why they had refused duty, they were exonerated and allowed to go back on duty. So know that men like this, far from being, when he came home, he was accepted back into the community, as was this gentleman. Charles Vesey. So I have a strong feeling that these men not only were accepted back into the community, but were admired for standing up for their rights. The soldier volunteer was a whole different guy from the regular army, as their commanders would find out. We have Joseph Hackett. He was a sailor. He was later known in the community as Captain Hackett.
Second Maine Cavalry.
You want to talk about that?
Somebody wrote a really good book about the Second Maine Cavalry. Oh, yeah, it was me. They were sent to the Deep South. It's one of those regiments that, again, people talk about, I'm going to talk about later also, that people say that more men died of disease than of battle wounds. That depended on where you went. If you were a kid from Maine who was sent to Louisiana, yeah, you were probably going to die of disease. My second book on the, my first book, 22nd Maine, they lost more men, yeah, to disease, no question. But if you were in the Army of the Potomac fighting against Lee in Virginia, typically it went the other way around. Second Maine Cavalry, they spent a lot of time around Barrancas or in Florida and doing raiding kind of stuff, going up and blowing up railroads and stuff like that. Not a highly visible part of the war, quite honestly, but they did good. The guy who was their commanding officer, another one of those colorful characters who was, where was he from? One of the islands off the coast of Maine. Anyway, he was known for putting on a somewhat grayish uniform and going behind enemy lines to find out what was going on. Didn't get caught. Charles Tilden, he had been captain of that 2nd Maine, the Castine regiment, Castine company, I mean. The 16th Maine, as I was saying, some of you weren't here yet, but I was talking about the fact that when we did we used to work we had volunteered as guides at the Chamberlain Museum. And I used to ask people how many Maine regiments were at Gettysburg. One? No, there were 15. The 16th Maine, on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. The Confederates were coming, oddly enough, they were converging from the north and the west. A guy named Robinson, who was the division commander, General Robinson, went up to Colonel Tilden and said, I want you to form your men here and hold to the last man. They had about 300 men left at that point. So you have 20,000 Confederates coming this way and another 20,000 coming that way. And they did. They formed a V and stood there until they were captured. And there's some controversy about that. I wonder, we're going to talk about the young man for whom the GAR post here in Castine was named. It was originally named for Colonel Tilden. Colonel Tilden said every man who did his duty was killed, wounded, or captured. Well, the guy that wrote the history of the 16th Maine, a guy named Abner Small, felt differently. As the Confederates were converging and they were about to be captured, he and 30-something other guys said, I'm out of here, and made it back to the Union lines. I don't think it was an act of cowardice, because they were being shot at while they were running back toward their own lines, but it didn't go down well, apparently. And we were talking about earlier, the men, as they were being captured, first off, Colonel Tilden drove his sword in the ground and broke it off so that it wouldn't be captured by a Confederate officer. And then they tore their flag into little pieces, squares. And the men hid them around in their uniform, their boots, their hair, whatever. Some of those pieces are at the Maine State Museum down in Augusta, because every time the survivors would get together, they would get out their little piece of the flag and put it out on a table. It's quite a story. And that's the 16th Maine that very few people have even heard of. Good-looking guy, by the way.
He's our hero.
Yeah. Well, and as I was saying to somebody earlier, I'm a bit bitter. I was a sergeant, okay, E6, staff sergeant. If you were an officer, you got sent to Libby Prison. And 103, 108 men escaped. If you were an enlisted man, you got sent to Belle Isle, which was a swamp, and you died. Or most of them did, anyway. Libby Prison was a converted cotton warehouse. So I'm bitter. But they escaped. Well done them. They dug a tunnel under one of the fireplace things. Anyway, another 16th Maine. Again, I passed that bullet. Did I get my bullet back, by the way? Oh. I was talking about the amputations. Yeah. The brother of the guy in the 2nd Maine. How many of you have been out to the airport in Bangor any time when troops were coming or going from deployment? As I get older, they look like a high school class on a field trip. They're young, and we often see pictures of Civil War veterans as older men. They were a bunch of kids. It was just like those kids that you see out, at the airport coming or going. Anyway, some of the lucky ones, if you were a prisoner early in the war especially, you might get exchanged. You'd be held in a parole camp until somebody from the other side could be swapped for you. Or sometimes you went back to your unit, but you promised you wouldn't go back and fight until you found somebody to, right, that worked. Anyway, yeah, here's one of the lucky guys who did get exchanged and survived. The Veteran Reserve Corps was just guys who were not fit for combat, but did kind of background duty. The guy we've gotten to know really well. Isn't it silly that after all these years, I'm still upset by the fact that he didn't come home? His letters to his wife Mary and his son Freddie are just so full of, kiss little Freddie for me. Not a good-looking guy, by the way. His letters, sorry. Yeah, he was wounded later and died. He was one of the ones that was, he got back and then he was wounded. Look, he died of wounds March 2nd, 65. Lee surrendered his army in April of 65. Yeah. Well, it proved out to be Lee. That's right. Yeah. Oops, sorry. There are the rings that the Historical Society here has that he made out of animal bone and sent home for his wife and Freddie. And there's his grave marker in Baltimore. We chased down where he was actually buried. And again, as I was saying, you had to pay to have the kid's body brought home, so a lot of them are not buried here. Here we go. First main heavies. Am I undoing them? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. As I was saying, here's a musket you are now. They went in at a place called Colquitt Salient at Petersburg. Well, their first battle was at Spotsylvania, and they lost, 400 men or so there. June 18th. We are not fans, by any means, of Ulysses Grant. He had one strategy: frontal assault. Let's lie. Can I borrow you two folks, since I know you? Come on up here. No, just, turn around, face down. This is how we're going to advance at the enemy. Shoulder to shoulder, straight at them. World War I, we're doing that against machine guns, by the way. I just thought I'd mention that. Anyway, first main heavies. They went in at Colquitt Stadium with 903. Anyway, they lost 2/3 of their regiment in about 10 minutes. The unit from the Union that lost the most men in a single action. They had no training as infantry. They were doing the shoulder to shoulder. Here we go. Not very many. Have you been to Gettysburg, any of you? Lots of monuments. Very few at Petersburg, and that's one of the ones that is there. And yes, we brought flowers. As I say, we are softies. I'm such a softie. We were visiting battlefields in France, World War I. There was a big military cemetery. I went and bought a bugle and played the last post, which is the British version of taps. I just thought, yeah, why not? Survived. As did this gentleman. Notice the age. He was 44 when he was mustered in. So not a little kid. And you talked about Dr. Wheeler. I like that picture of him as a young man. I think that's really cool. He wrote the history of Castine. Can you imagine what a surgeon or assistant surgeon's job would be? Not pleasant. And there's the kit that is here on display. Some pretty basic stuff. You can see in the middle there, the pointy thing like that, it's a bullet probe. And yeah, you didn't. I'm afraid it might be like a catheter type. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Light artillery, are you doing them?
I think so.
Okay. This was as opposed to, you know those great big guns like down at Fort Knox? The heavy artillery were guys in permanent positions with those guns that you're told don't climb on them, but we always stuff our kids in them and take pictures. Yeah. The light artillery were the horse artillery.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Rolliston Woodbury. So 5th Battery Light Artillery. When one looks at their families, there was so much loss. It's hard to realize how a family could deal with so much heartache. For the Woodburys in the 1860s, they not only had this son, Rolliston, to worry about, who did make it back, but Rolliston's sister, Hattie, 20 years old, died 1863. Another sister, age 8, died 1863. Rolliston's first wife, Nellie Lovejoy, whom he married in 1867, died the next year of measles at age 27. It's hard to imagine how a family could cope. This is an image of Rolliston's battery.
When they talk about the caissons go rolling along, those are caissons that carried the ammunition.
Good.
Are you clicking yourself?
No, I have a
Designated
I have an assistant. Yeah. We're looking at Charles Hatton. Know that when you're doing research on Maine Civil War, the Adjutant General of Maine was just remarkable about keeping records of the Army. He did a wonderful job, and luckily those who came after him preserved those records, so they were a wonderful resource for the Army. But the Navy, the records are almost non-existent. So we try and realize that there were men like Charles Hatton, came rather to a terrible end. He was serving on a ship. Shall we go to the next one? Thank you. That hit what at the time was called a torpedo, but was actually a mine, a gunboat he was serving on, that was just completely blown apart. And we have to assume that the grave marker here is, again, a memorial as opposed to an actual grave. Good. Roland B. Brown was luckier. He was an officer, a naval officer. He actually received a medal for his service at the capture of Plymouth, North Carolina. He survived the war, came home. Oh, that, by the way, could we go back one, please? That center ship is the one that he not only served on, the USS Shamrock, but also eventually became captain of that ship. Okay. After the war, Roland Brown was captain of a very famous ship at the time, the Annie Smith, much admired ship, a clipper. And interestingly, he again was from Castine. He brought his wife and children on his voyages around the world. Amazing adventures, I'm sure. although such travel was not without risk at the time, and life aboard one of these ships was far from comfortable, really.
Yes, if it's Castine Harbor, it's not.
No,
Picture, no.
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 Where was that?
That photograph?
Yeah.
I'd have to find out. Yeah.
I can't remember.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about the cavalry. We have one of the Castine men who served in what first was called the D.C. Cavalry, which was mostly duty around the capital, but later became the 1st Maine Cavalry. Know that the 1st Maine Cavalry suffered the most casualties of any federal cavalry regiment. He, as you can see, became a prisoner at one point. He was discharged for disability, whether that was illness or injury, I don't know. But one of the reasons to serving in the federal cavalry, particularly later in the war, why it was so dangerous is because when U.S. Grant came east as lieutenant general and decided to accompany the Army of the Potomac. He came east bringing 2 of his cronies, Phil Sheridan and James Wilson, neither of whom had any cavalry experience, but who he assigned to replace the experienced cavalry leaders in the Army of the Potomac, and the results were not good. Lots of casualties, lots of prisoners taken. And like I say, the 1st Maine suffered the worst of it. This is you, my dear.
Hello.
I'm going to take these.
Okay. We're sort of working on our next book together. The 31st Maine and the 32nd Maine were the last regiments raised in the state. They lost so many men, they were combined into one regiment that was still under strength. How many of you ever heard of the Battle of the Crater at Petersburg? They were in that crater. Do I have a picture of that? Can we look at the next? No, I don't. Never mind. You can still see the crater at Petersburg. I was talking to people at a World War I battlefield in France where they had the idea of digging a tunnel under the enemy line and blowing it up. That's what they did at Petersburg. It became known as the Battle of the Crater. They blew this horrendous hole in the Confederate line and then went into the big hole and were getting, didn't go well. Anyway, yeah, go ahead, sorry. Another 31st Maine guy. One of the things that I always found fascinating, we talked about the 16th Maine and their terrible losses. They sent some of the survivors back to Maine on recruiting duty. That must have been a tough sell. We just lost. How many guys? Would you like to join up? That will never happen again. Anyway, how many of you were in the service? You remember some of the promises that were made by recruiting people? Anyway, sorry. Go ahead. Both of the regiments that I've written unit history were sent to the Deep South. And if you look at those numbers, I was talking earlier about dependent on where you went. Pretty dramatic difference, huh? Yeah, go ahead. One of the regiments sent to the Deep South. You want a cough drop, by the way? Your voice sounded hoarse.
No, I'm good.
Okay, I'll have it. Yeah, go ahead.
He was the town minister.
Yeah. Yep. Go ahead. Yep, you can go ahead. Another assistant surgeon, 26th man, again, sent to the Deep South. And I don't know anything about Charles Collins. It's a veteran stone, obviously. But a New Hampshire regiment, which we don't. If you ever are interested, by the way, if you think you have, or know you have ancestors, the main adjutant general's reports, most libraries would have a set, and you can go look up the regiment. In the 1866 edition of the reports are kind of like following the regiment through the war, where they were and when they were and what happened to them. Yeah, go ahead. You were going to talk about Tom, weren't you?
Yes, yes, I will. Thank you. Tom Chamberlain is buried here in Castine, youngest brother of Joshua Chamberlain. As you probably know, the family was from Brewer. So how did Tom end up being in Castine's cemetery? He was the youngest boy in the Chamberlain family. Their mother was very reluctant to let him go to war, but agreed, given that his older brother, Joshua, would be keeping an eye on him. Tom had a hard time after the war. Post-traumatic stress didn't exist then, but needless to say, there were many men who suffered from it, and I believe that Tom was one of them. Several things, I think, influenced Tom. His best friend, also his cousin, a captain in the 9th Maine named Billings Braistow, had actually finished his term of service. He was slated to go home when his regiment, he knew his regiment was going into battle, and he stayed on, and he was killed. He and Tom apparently had talked before they went to the front, supposing that at least one of them wouldn't come back. And there's a peculiar thing that happens sometimes. The survivor has what's described as survivor guilt. And I think that was something that happened to Tom as far as Billings Braistow was concerned. Tom and Joshua both served in the Federal Army. They had a brother, John, who served in what was known as the Christian Commission. And John was actually at Gettysburg with his brother Joshua and Tom, but he was behind the lines tending the wounded. And it's believed that that's where he contracted TB that would take his life shortly after the war. And that brings us to why Tom is buried here in Castine. John, the brother John, died in 1867. He was married to a Castine woman named Delia Farley Jarvis. And in 1870, Tom married his brother John's widow. And so he's buried next to her here in Castine. You are up again. Yep.
Wow. I put this person in as an example. We have a lot of respect for the Find a Grave folks. They do some really good stuff, but they also get things wrong from time to time. And people who make tombstones, when you see First Maine Bat, and it's recorded as First Maine Battery, he wasn't in the First Maine Battery. He was in the First Maine Battalion, infantry. But you have to kind of chase around to find out where is this guy? Well, that's where he ended up. Oh, go ahead. I forgot we have a clicker. The Coast Guards. A lot of times these were older guys. You can see this gentleman was 44. A lot of them did duty in forts. The First Maine, I talked about the First Maine Heavy Artillery, right, and all their terrible losses. One contingent of the First Maine Heavies was stationed over at Fort Knox with those great big guns over there. And a couple of them died of exposure, I am told. And a couple of them deserted. It was cold. I don't know. Anyway, meanwhile, the rest of the regiment was getting shot to pieces. Yeah, go ahead. This is a drawing of the fort where this person was stationed, not in Maine. Yep. 14th Maine. Also spent time in the Deep South. And there's a reason why I included the 14th Maine. You can go ahead. If you have questions about any of these people, by the way, feel free to ask. I'll answer. Yeah. This is the person who the GAR post ended up being named for. Port Hudson was called the Gibraltar of the Mississippi. It was a big Confederate fort. It took a long time. It didn't really fall until Vicksburg fell, and then the Confederates couldn't really maintain that fort anymore. So they all surrendered and were paroled, and within a month they were all back in the Confederate Army. Their commanding officer who had surrendered said, "Oh, I actually never got orders from Richmond to surrender, so I guess it didn't count." Okay. Port Hudson, my book on the 22nd Maine, they spent a lot of time in that siege of Port Hudson. Okay. A young man named Frank Ireland, I used his letters in my book. Wonderful guy. But let me give you an example of something. The guy who was the colonel, Simon Girard, in their first battle, they're going across a field toward an enemy line, a Confederate line. And Simon Girard sees a Confederate officer with his sword raised, getting ready to give the order to fire. When the Confederate officer's arm came down, Girard yelled, "Down!" They all hit the dirt. Nobody got killed. Now, if a dairy farmer from Glenburn could figure that out, right? They stood up, charged, and won the day. I don't get it. I mean, was it just not manly to duck? But Simon Girard, a dairy farmer from Glenburn. Oh, well. Anyway, go ahead. We've already talked about the two brothers. The 14th Battalion they didn't have enough men to form a regiment. So they had I think 5 or 6 companies instead of the usual 10 or 12 and formed a battalion. Yep, go ahead. An example, this is why I was including the 14th Maine, where some of these kids from Maine ended up. They spent a lot of time in the Deep South, as you can see. Baton Rouge. That was a nasty fight, by the way. Yeah, go ahead to the next one. we weren't done. And again, a lot of these battles are not ones that a lot of people know about, but they were all over the place and lost a lot of men. Yeah, go ahead. And Diane's going to tell you about Noah Brooks, an interesting guy.
I wanted to be sure that we included Noah Brooks. He was not a soldier. He was actually a journalist, and he was from Castine. And talk about remembering one's roots. Noah was working for a California newspaper and was sent east to Washington to cover the Lincoln administration and the Civil War. He wrote 200 and something articles for his newspaper under the byline of Castine, is what he called himself. He had remarkable sources in that before the war, he had met Lincoln in Illinois and become quite friendly with him. And when he was sent to Washington, he renewed that friendship and became a real confidant as far as Lincoln was concerned, and was frequently at the White House. So I wanted you to be sure to remember Noah Brooks. Although he had no military service, he was a remarkable Castine man.
A lot of Maine boys. We have a camp. It's in New Brunswick. How many of you know where Grand Manan is? Oh, good. We have a. I used to say we have a cottage. No, FDR had a cottage. We have a camp. Every year in November, all of the telephone poles in the village and other villages in New Brunswick have a big banner, a photograph of a veteran, and all it says is, "Lest we forget." And we think, sorry, I sometimes get a bit choked up, because we need to remember not just the Civil War, but all, and just not jumping up and down and going, yeah, we're number one, but just remember what these kids did. I think, yeah, that's some GAR veterans from Castine. Those are GAR uniforms. It looks like a cavalry hat, but it's actually a part of their GAR. The Grand Army of the Republic was one of the... Really? Huh. Could be. Could be. Yeah. We know he was there somewhere. There was another... Yeah, a little round top. Yeah. It's an interesting... You're about to be overwhelmed. You've run out of ammunition. They were on the extreme flank of the Union Army. If they caved in, the Confederates were going to go around that flank, and that would not be a good thing. I wish I brought... Darn. Our younger son, Alex, was one of the... If you've seen the movie Gettysburg, Alex is in it. He's one of the 6,000 reenactors that they had there for the battle. I should have brought his musket, because if you have .58 caliber Enfield, which is musket is, and then add a bayonet. And if I came running at you with that, you're probably going to say, gee, I wonder if that's loaded or not. And that's what they did. They ended up capturing and chasing off, what was the 48th Alabama, was it? 15th Alabama, that was close. Yeah. But sometimes you do what you need to do. And again, I'm by no means the only heroic act on that field. He did the job. There was a guy, I will tell you one more anecdote. I know we're almost out of time.
Use the mic, huh?
Use the mic, hon. If it was German, it would be a Hun mic. Sorry. Yeah. When Diane finished her first book, Fanny and Joshua, we discovered that a friend of my mother's had a grandfather who was in the 20th Maine, a guy named Andrew Tozier. And Diane said, well, why didn't you ever tell me about him? Well, she said, I didn't think he really amounted to much. All he did was carry the flag. Well, he also got the Medal of Honor. The flag company were the guys that were going to stand their ground no matter what. And Andrew Tozier got the Medal of Honor. And we talked about post-traumatic stress. After the war, he became kind of a shady character, heavy drinker. I'm not surprised. But I think the family had kind of downplayed his story because of that. But when he was there at Little Round Top, he did his job. He only carried the flag. Any other questions? Yes. About the blanket brigade? Yeah. Do you know much about the blanket brigade?
No.
I don't either. I know they were the ones who were out in the cold. Yeah, but I don't really know the details. Sorry. Anything else? Anyway, thank you, folks.
Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. We really appreciate it. And do come back. We have a whole section on Noah Brooks in the exhibit upstairs, so thank you for including him. And I'll show you where his house is. And also Roland Brown. I'd forgotten, we have Roland Brown's house portrait. So a lot of connections through this talk. You'll be able to see objects that help bring this further to life. So thank you all for coming, and have a good evening. Drive safe.